All right, folks. So this is the next part, 6-5. This is the meat of the chapter. It's not to say the other sections aren't important. They are. But this is about bone formation. So how do we get this darn bone anyway? So there's two ways to get bone. There's endochondral ossification. That's the word you see right here. And there's intramembranous ossification. Most of the bones of our body are formed by endochondral ossification. Endo means within and chondral means cartilage. So endochondral ossification means within a cartilage. Intramembranous ossification means within a membrane. And that membrane, by the way, is the dermis, or at least it's dense, irregular connective tissue like the dermis. So some people call intramembranous ossification dermal ossification. Some people do, some texts do. All right, let's talk about this. Here is the first step of endochondral ossification. You start with a cartilaginous framework right there. So when you're a fetus, all your bones, well, the ones that are going to be endochondrally ossified anyway, look like this. They are a cartilage framework like that. If you were to maintain that, you'd be like a shark. If you never ossified your bones, your skeleton would be a cartilage like a shark. But as it turns out, we ossify our bones. All right, so this is the cartilaginous framework that we have here. And there's chondrocytes in there. See that word chondrocytes? Because chondrocytes make cartilage. All right, now what happens in step one is these chondrocytes start to enlarge. All right, they enlarge, and they lay down cartilage, and then they start to disintegrate, and they start to die and disintegrate, and they leave this cavity here because they died and disintegrated. So now they've left this little cavity. So that's the step one. You have this cartilaginous framework. The chondrocytes enlarge and lay down a bunch of cartilage. And the main protein of cartilage, by the way, is collagen. And then the large chondrocytes die and disintegrate. And they leave cavities in there. Then blood vessels grow around the edges of my cartilaginous framework. So you can see blood vessels growing around the edges here. Right here. Well, I don't know which direction this arterial blood is flowing, but it's growing around the edge of that. And it delivers some fibroblasts to the cells of this perichondrium. Now remember, this is a perichondrium until you have bone. Perichondrium. You're going to say to me, I thought I called it periosteum. Yeah, it's going to be periosteum when this is bone, but right now it's cartilage. And what happens is some of the cells underneath my perichondrium convert to osteoblasts. So some of these cells are now osteoblasts. Well, you know what osteoblasts do. Osteoblasts build bone. And then what I do is these osteoblasts lay down bone, and this becomes what we call a bony collar. And I don't think your book calls it that, but I'm telling you that's what they call it, a bony collar. So I have a bony collar around my diaphysis. So what's step two? Forming a bony collar around my diaphysis. All right, so I have my bony collar. Now, before I can turn the inside of this to bone, I got to get some nutrients in there. I mean, remember, to ossify, you need a source of calcium. Well, who carries the calcium for us? Blood. So I got to get blood in there. But I just created a bony collar. No problem. What my blood vessel does is it grows into the center of my cartilaginous framework. That's what my blood vessel does. It penetrates that. The blood vessel penetrates the bony collar and grows into the cartilage. This is going to be called my primary ossification center. Now what happens is blood vessels carry some fibroblasts with it into the center. Those fibroblasts differentiate into osteoblasts and lay down this bone. So my fibroblasts differentiate into osteoblasts and lay down bone. That shouldn't shock you too much, because what do fibroblasts make anyway? They make connective tissue proper, And let me just remind you what connective tissue proper is. It's loose and it's dense. Loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. Loose is areolar, adipose, and reticular. Dense is dense regular and dense irregular. But fibroblasts lay down connective tissue proper. Whereas osteoblasts are one of two cells that lay down supporting connective tissue. The other cell is chondroblast. The primary protein of both supporting connective tissue and connective tissue proper is collagen. So fibroblasts and osteoblasts aren't doing that different a job. But the fibroblasts differentiate into osteoblasts, and the osteoblasts lay down the osteoid, and then it's calcified into this bone. And this is called my primary ossification center. Now notice it's all spongy. So let's recap. What happened during step 1 is my chondrocytes enlarged and died and left a cavity. Got big, then died. That's big, by the way. They got big and then died. Left a cavity. What happened in 2? Bony collar. What happened in 3? My artery, I have a perforating artery. That means it perforated the bony collar. I have a perforating artery, and osteoblast laid down bone in the primary ossification center. Osteoblast laid down bone in the primary ossification center. Okay, that's what happened so far. Then, well, back here, remember I said to you, notice it's all spongy bone. Then I remodel that spongy bone. So I'm not going to leave this all to be spongy bone. I'm going to start remodeling it. I'm going to change some of it into dense bone. And when I do that, I do leave spongy bone in the center into what becomes my medullary cavity. So this becomes my medullary cavity, and that's always going to have spongy bone in it. But I remodel some of this bone out here into compact bone. So that's what remodeling is doing. It is taking some of the spongy bone and remodeling it into compact bone. But I'm still only working within my primary ossification center. That's it. Now before I move on to the next step, this all happens before you're born. Alright, so this is all occurring before you're born. Now what may occur before you're born or may not in some bones is the exact same process in what we call the secondary ossification center. Not all your bones have a secondary ossification center by the time you're born. Ossification. So some of your bones you're born with in the epiphyses are still cartilage. But don't worry, because as a baby, you set up these secondary ossification centers and you ossify your epiphyses. But remember, these epiphyses are primarily spongy bone. So even after secondary ossification goes on, you're leaving that as spongy bone. You don't remodel it to compact bone. You only remodel the diaphysis. The secondary ossification center, the exact same thing happens. You have another perforating artery right there. That perforating artery comes in. Well, here's another bony collar first. All right, let me back up. We might as well just recap the steps. In my secondary ossification center, the same steps occur, and that is chondrocytes enlarge and die. They leave a cavity. 2, I have a perforating artery. No. Wow. 2, I have a bony collar. Getting way ahead of myself. Bony collar. 3, perforating artery. Fibroblasts become osteoblasts. And I set up my secondary ossification center. All right. 4. Now 4 below is remodeling. But 4 up here isn't remodeling, but I can build more of this. So all I do is increase in diameter. Let's just leave it. Increase in diameter. All right. So that happens with my secondary ossifications. Some of my bones that has occurred by the time I'm born. Some of my bones that doesn't occur until after I'm born. Now, Eventually, and this is what I actually said, increase in diameter, your epiphysis is filled with spongy bone, but we always leave this. It's called the epiphyseal growth plate. And it's a thin layer of hyaline cartilage between my diaphysis and my epiphysis. All right, between my diaphysis and my epiphysis. And this is where I grow. So if I want to grow taller because I just had a surge of growth hormone, that growth hormone comes down in here and tells these chondroblasts to lay down new cartilage. And then I ossify that cartilage. Still leaving, always leaving, a thin layer of epiphyseal growth plate. The next time I have a surge of growth hormone, the growth hormone tells these chondroblasts to lay down new cartilage. And then the osteoblasts invade the area and calcify that cartilage. Still leaving a thin layer of epiphyseal growth plate. But eventually, and it depends on whether you're male or female, eventually you do ossify that epiphyseal growth plate. If you're female, you ossify it around 18 years old. If you're male, you ossify it around, 22, 23 years old. Of course, there's a range for both. Some females could keep growing until they're 22, 23. But the bottom line is females stop growing younger than men. Men leave epiphyseal growth plates in their bone until an older age, like 22, 23 years old. Whereas females ossify that earlier and stop growing tall. Now, could their bones grow thicker? Absolutely. That's called appositional growth. Bones growing thicker is called appositional growth. Bones growing taller is called linear growth. You can only grow linear if you have this epiphyseal growth plate. All right. As soon as you ossify that epiphyseal growth plate, you are done growing tall. Okay. In addition, on my epiphysis, I've left some hyaline cartilage here at the end, and it stays there hopefully the rest of your life. It's a slippery hyaline cartilage involved in articulations. And when I say hopefully it's there the rest of your life, because if you break that down, you have arthritis. That's where arthritis is the breakdown of your articular cartilage, which is hyaline cartilage. So articular cartilage is simply hyaline cartilage, but it's hyaline cartilage involved in a joint, in articulation. All right, we'll come back to arthritis in a bit, by the way. This is showing you a bone that has ossified its, this is showing you a bone that has ossified its epiphyseal growth plate. This bone is done growing tall. We call it the epiphyseal line when the epiphyseal growth plate becomes ossified. And we call the action of changing an epiphyseal growth plate to an epiphyseal line epiphyseal closure. So this is a verb. So epiphyseal closure is ossifying the epiphyseal growth plate into the epiphyseal line. Now you're done growing tall. But you can still grow wide. Your bone can gain width, diameter. It just can't gain length. And we always, always, always leave this articular cartilage even after you've ossified the growth plate. And hopefully you keep your articular cartilage your whole life or you'll have arthritis. This is the summary or the collage, steps 1 through 4. Make sure you know them. Make sure you understand we start with a cartilaginous framework. This is steps 5 through 7. Make sure you get it. Make sure you understand that this area is my primary ossification center, and these two areas are secondary. Primary, diaphysis, secondary, epiphysis. Make sure you understand that the primary ossification of our bones has occurred by the time we're born, but the secondary ossification may or may not have so far. Some bones yes, some bones no. All right, the next type of ossification is called intramembranous ossification. And it happens in the bones of our skull. And it's similar to endochondral ossification, But the big thing here is you don't start with cartilage. You start with dense irregular connective tissue. That's not cartilage. All right. It is a connective tissue like cartilage is a connective tissue, but it is more like the dermis of your skin. And hence, we call this dermal ossification, and we call the bones from dermal ossification dermal bones. Because it's almost like you're creating bone from the dermis of your skin. And in fact, that's how some people think about this. So you start with dense irregular connective tissue. What happens? Well, what happens is this. Mesenchyme cells cluster. You know what? I better not number it like that, because your book's calling mesenchyme cluster 1. So first of all, I start with dense regular, and then I have mesenchyme cluster, mesenchyme cells cluster. Now what they do is some of them differentiate into osteoblasts, and osteoblasts do what they do. They lay down osteoid and they start to ossify it. All right. So I've already started doing this. You can see this right here. Is that this? Oh, they've already laid down osteoid. So some of these mesenchyme cells cluster, and you see this circle of clusters right here. They differentiate into osteoblasts, and they lay down this osteoid, which is calcified into bone. So I've already started making these little islands of bones, these little islands of bone. That's what I've started to make. And then what happens? Well, I start lengthening those islands, and the islands start growing together. Like this is going to become a spicule. As this grows outward over to here, and they fuse those two together, this will be a spicule. You can see that this one's becoming a spicule. It's going someplace. It's going to be a strut. Oh, spicules, if that's a word you don't like, think of a strut. So these spicules are going to become, these bone fragments right here are going to be, that fragment's not the right word. These islands of bones keep growing outward, outward, outward until we form these spicules or struts. Now, what happens is I have trapped some blood vessels inside hard bone. Let me see if I was showing you doing this back here. Yeah, look at this. Would you agree that if I fuse these two spicules right here and I fuse these two spicules right here, well, I circled part that wasn't a spicule, but here's definitely the formation of an early spicule, and here's a spicule. Would you agree if I fuse them that I've trapped that blood vessel in the center? I think you would. So yeah, we trap these blood vessels in the center. So now I have trapped blood vessels. All right. Now, what does that mean? Well, with these trapped blood vessels in here delivering oxygen to my osteoblast and osteocytes, I have increased bone production, increased ossification. Increased oxygen means increased metabolism, which is increased ossification. All right, so that's important that we trap these blood vessels in this dermal bone because it increases the formation of the bone. Then what I have is this. Now I start remodeling. I remodel this outer layer into compact bone. And it doesn't matter if it's the top outer or the bottom outer. I remodel that into compact bone. The center stays spongy bone. So really what I'm doing is I'm sandwiching spongy bone. That's what I'm doing. And you can see that right there. So it says subsequent remodeling leads to this right here. That's what it looks like. And blood vessels run throughout, as you can see here. All right. All right. That's intramembranous ossification. That's intramembranous ossification, the bones of your skull. Here's the collage showing you what's going on there. So you're going to say, well, that's really similar to endochondral. You have cells that differentiate into osteoblasts, and osteoblasts lay down bone, and then you remodel it. That's all the same. That's what endochondral did. Yeah, it's similar. The big, huge difference is how it started. The endochondral ossification started with a cartilaginous framework. whereas intramembranous ossification started with dense irregular connective tissue and mesenchyme cells. So that's the big, huge difference between the two. Now let's look at this.
Bones grow through the process of appositional growth, the formation of new bone on the surface of older bone or cartilage. Osteoblasts beneath the periosteum lay down bone to form ridges around a blood vessel. The blood vessel lies in a groove between the ridges. The groove is transformed into a tunnel when the bone built on the adjacent ridges meets. The periosteum of the groove becomes the endosteum of the tunnel. Osteoblasts from the endosteum lay down bone to form a new concentric lamella. The production of additional concentric lamellae fills in the tunnel and completes the formation of a new osteon.
All right, folks, I want to take you back and just show you something pretty important. Do you see how the periosteum becomes the endosteum? I mean, if you look right here, this is periosteum. But after I make this closure right here, that periosteum becomes the endosteum of that central canal. And it shouldn't, and having said that, you probably remember just from the first part of this chapter that the periosteum and the endosteum have similar functions. They have osteoprogenitor cells and osteoclasts underneath those layers, because remember, the periosteum and endosteum are dense irregular connective tissues. So does it surprise you they have similar functions? The periosteum can become the endosteum when you do appositional growth. So that probably doesn't surprise you. All right. That's appositional growth, or growing wider versus taller. So knowing that you don't ossify your epiphyseal growth plates if you're a male until your young 20s, and if you're a female, later teens, knowing that, and doctors know this, we can actually look at an x-ray and to see if there's epiphyseal growth plates there. Now remember, epiphyseal growth plates are cartilage. That's soft tissue. Bone is bone. That's hard tissue. So x-rays show bones, but they don't show this cartilage in here. And you can see it appears as lines because the x-rays are going through instead of bouncing off. So I can approximate the age of this person. I know that if they're a male, I know that they're not 22, 23 yet. And if they're female, I know that they're probably not 18 yet. Versus this one where they're close. The epiphyseal growth plates are ossified. And you can see a thin, I'm looking to see if I can see a thin epiphyseal line. Because sometimes you have to use your imagination. I don't see an epiphyseal line. But a lot of times I've seen x-rays where you do. Actually, I do. Boy, you got to kind of use your imagination, though. Right in here someplace. Maybe here. Yeah, I'm starting to see it now. Yeah, if you look at it long enough, maybe your brain's just playing tricks on you, telling you there's a line there. Anyway, there's supposed to be lines there. I've seen x-rays where the lines are beautiful, but the epiphyseal lines are dense enough to make the x-rays bounce off them, so you can see them in an x-ray like that. All right. Remember back to when we first started doing endochondral ossification, my first artery right here was a perforating artery. It perforates through the bony collar in what we call the nutrient foramen. Every bone has to have 3 of these. It's usually only 1 per diaphysis, although your femur has more than 1 because it's so big. So at least you have to have 1 nutrient foramen in the diaphysis. And you have to have another nutrient foramen in the proximal epiphysis and 1 nutrient foramen in the distal epiphysis. That's what you need. Some of the larger bones like the femur will have a couple nutrient foramen in the diaphysis. That nutrient foramen is important. It's how your blood vessels get in here. It's how the blood vessels get to the medullary cavity, and then they just grow. When this angiogenesis occurs, when the blood vessel's growing, it just grows in between the spicules. It doesn't have to worry about that because the spongy bone has so much space that the blood vessels just grow in the space. So that's nutrient foramen. All right. And that's it. Next section coming up.